Pleased to have Rick Evans here with us today. Rick is an advisory board visiting fellow at the Baker Institute of Public Policy at Rice University. He's also director of the Open Source Economics Laboratory and president of Open Research Group. Rick is a contributor to the Policy Simulation Library in a number of ways, including being the core maintainer of two models, OG Core and OG USA. Rick, good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason. Love doing these demo days. So what I'm going to present today is a paper, US debt deficits and stabilization options. And this is really, it's a paper that is almost done. I'm going to take you through, all the results are done. There's just some writing and cleanup, and then I think it's going to come out through the Baker Institute. But I think the timing of this is perfect because we're at this point in the United States where we really have full 400-year history of our country, record debt to GDP, and probably maybe later this week, we're going to pass the Build Back Better Act, which is, adding even more spending and debt to that equation. And then I just think the question is going to be what's next in 2022, and are we ever going to try to rein in that trajectory of the US debt? And so this paper speaks to that. I'm going to take you just through some of the executive summary points and the results, but I think I'm going to use the economics of this as a backdrop for really saying the broader point: how do you take sprawling technical results and make those available to the layperson? And so this is the first paper that I've ever done where all of the visualizations are open source, like individually there's code to create those and the data. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Let's see, what do I want? That's what I want. So this is the first paper where all of the visualizations, if I just scroll through this document here, you're going to see visualizations start coming up. I have made all of these visualizations public at this GitHub repository called Deficit Party. There's kind of a double meaning there that's fun. But this is something where you could download, or you could clone, fork, download this repository, and then run the code for creating these visualizations. And then, as you're going to see, they're fully interactive visualizations as well. So I want to highlight the things in this paper that allow the non-expert, non-economist layperson to look at the data, search the data, do different things with the data. And then there's also a few open source models that I use at the end for one of the simulations and analyses that just want to highlight the value of open source models, which kind of is always a theme in these demo days. So some of the main points I want to make are, I'll just put this slide up as I talk about this, but one, dynamic visualizations can be a great exploration tool for the layperson. And things like visualization widgets with slider bars. This is a way that you can crowdsource policy options. And I think it's also a great way to convince people of the robustness of results or what the limits of policy are. And then open source models, the model I'll show at the end of this presentation. Making your model open source and open access is a great way to neutralize political polarization and political attacks, which saying, hey, you're dumb because you're this side of center or Republican or Democrat. What we really want to do is have people focus on the assumptions of the model, and it also incentivizes verification of the model. It incentivizes people to make extensions and modifications, do sensitivity analysis. Open source modeling also allows you to scale collaboration. So I'm going to show some simulations, but these are things that people could take and add features to this model rather than having to build something similar from the ground up. And like I said, it really, the open source nature of these topics really takes away any political biases that the policy analyst might have and focuses the debate on the underlying economic assumptions. All right, so let me jump into this this paper. I'll just show you the table of contents. It'll be actually quite a bit longer than this. There are a couple sections in section 5 that I haven't finished writing. That'll be at least 10 more pages, but they're all outlined out. I'm just going to show you some of the results. It'll almost be like a tour of these results by looking at the visualizations. That's the best way to see any results anyway. But I'm going to start with the chapter 2 stuff on the current US debt and deficits. And then I'm going to highlight some US government spending side issues that I thought were pretty interesting. And then there's a lot, if you look at pages 8 through 20 are about deficits, US deficits by party control, who controls Congress and the White House, Democrats or Republicans. And so form your priors right now about what deficits look like when one party or the other party controls those. And I think you'll be surprised what the results are. Section 5 really doesn't have a lot of visualizations, but I'll just tell you some of the results there. What are the risks of high government debt? But then finally, I want to finish and focus on these simulations that I've done. How do you stabilize the debt? And the experiment's going to be, what is the result of cutting government spending or increasing taxes? And both of those decrease the trajectory of the debt to GDP ratio, but they have very different effects on the economy, and it takes a large scale macroeconomic model to answer those questions. All right, so let's jump in with current US debt and deficits. I want to start back on this repository. This is a GitHub repository. It's open source econ/deficit party. I'll just put that link in the chat to this repository. All of the visualizations you're going to see are available by running one of these scripts. So for example, this time series public debt gdp.py. This code, if you run this, it's going to create a bokeh visualization. Bokeh is a package that creates D3 JavaScript dynamic visualizations that have things like hover tools, dynamic legends, zoom in, zoom out, highlighting particular data. I'll show you some of the value of this, but this code, you can just run this script and it'll create a figure that has some properties. It's going to be an area plot, and then there's going to be a vertical line segment in it. And then there's a bunch of labels on this figure. And it is this figure right here. This is US debt to GDP it says from 1900 to 2051. Oh, this one doesn't have any zoom out. So notice there's no functionality on this, and there's no hover tools. This is just a very basic figure, but it's a replication of a figure that CBO always makes. And this really highlights, you see the labels on here. It highlights that debt to GDP really always spikes when there's a war, when there's a big recession. We've got the Great Depression in 1929 and the Great Recession in 2008. Oh, we do have hover tools. There we are. So if I hover over the top of the line, it's going to show you what the year is and what the debt to GDP ratio is. Then you got the COVID pandemic, and then there's projected GDP. So by the end of this year, GDP is going to be bigger than it's ever been. And that's the next picture in this history, in this section, is that kind of US stimulus legislation over the last 12 years since the Great Recession has put us on a trajectory that's leading to record debt to GDP. So this is a picture where I've taken all the CBO debt to GDP long run projections and overlaid them. It goes from June 2009, which I think that is this one. Yeah, so it's this series that goes like that. And notice that these forecasts of debt to GDP from June 2009 until the most recent forecasts, there was a time in the June 2011 forecast that debt to GDP in 2050 was projected to be 85%. Debt to GDP, debt was going to be 85% of GDP. And as time has gone on since 2008, the current projection from the most recent long-term outlook of Congressional Budget Office is 195%. So this picture really shows from light to dark, oldest to most recent projections, how expectations have changed about what debt is going to do in the United States. I've got this table in this first section. These are kind of all the stimulus plans since 2008 and their net deficit increase over 10 years. We've got things in the $1 billion, we've got $1 trillion. The Build Back Better Act would probably be somewhere around $300 billion increase in deficits over the next 10 years. And so you can see that these are things adding to this expectation growth of debt to GDP. But this visualization, as you notice, as I hover over it, tells you the year, the debt to GDP ratio, and then which forecast we're looking at. And then there's additionally, I can use this zoom out function. And you can see that this data series actually goes all the way back to 1790, like the beginning of debt to GDP in the United States. And we're way in record territory. There's some other functionalities with these types of visualizations. I can click reset back to the original page. I can use this highlighting data. If I want to just look at the current around 2020 period, I can highlight those 10 years and it's a little easier to see which series is what and what they're doing. So this, let's see, where's the other thing I want to look at? One other thing I've done with these is not only have I created a GitHub repository with all the source code, but I've posted these images on a website. Let's see, where is that website? All right, I'm gonna have to open it. It's Open Source Economics Laboratory, oselab.org. And it's in the gallery. And in the gallery, I've posted some of these images. So if you click on comparisons of CBO, 16 CBO forecasts, you've got that same image. And this is in your web browser, fully functional operations of this dynamic visualization. All right, let me skip forward to some of the, oh, that's the website I wanted. Okay, let me skip forward to some of the government spending issues. So this is a very straightforward image from that repository of, this is US non-interest outlays as a percent of GDP. A couple things that stuck out to me here is that debt to GDP, or sorry, spending as a percent of GDP in the United States for the last 60 years has pretty reliably hovered between 15% and 20%. Except for these 4 years right after the Great Recession, so 2009 to 2012, and then 2020. So spending has had some real spikes. That I think those are the things that are creating this huge difference in the trajectory of debt to GDP right now. Additionally, if you look at mandatory versus discretionary spending, so if we break total non-interest spending in the United States into the mandatory component, think of that as Social Security, Medicare, farm subsidies. These are things that are on programs that are on automatic pilot versus the kind of things that you see in those congressional acts that get debated every year. That's the discretionary spending side. Mandatory spending is a percent of total non-interest spending. So if I break that into two parts, mandatory and discretionary, this is the mandatory part. It's risen from around 28% in 1965 to currently 73.8%. So that means vice versa, discretionary spending in 65 was 72%, and today it's 27%, 26%. So this, one thing that's interesting is spending, the mandatory components. If we just look at 2011 to 2020, The dollar amounts represented by those increases in mandatory spending are $2.5 trillion. And those are automatic. Those aren't the things that are getting debated in Congress like the Build Back Better Act is right now. It's fascinating, I think, to break that down, because when we think about potential spending cuts as a solution, I think it's not necessarily reining back the size of infrastructure bills or other safety net spending. It's these mandatory components also need to be looked at carefully. This is a very simple visualization. All it has is this hover over ability here. So next I want to look, oh, go ahead, Jason.
Let me just interject a quick question or comment, which is, you know, as a percentage of GDP, looking at these spending amounts or deficits in general, right? It's kind of biased. When GDP goes down, that's in the denominator. Like if I just look at the dollar amount of federal government expenditures, there wasn't much of an increase during the Great Recession. But as a percentage of GDP, it looks much larger. And you can kind of see this here with the mandatory spending, right? Which isn't something that was part of the stimulus package. And in 2020, it goes up like it looks like 8 percentage points of GDP.
Yeah, so that's the denominator dropping. You're right.
Yeah. And then I guess so I
haven't looked at that carefully, Jason. You must have looked at that. But when you go back, when you go back to like this table, I mean, you had the Economic Stimulus Act, which added 156 billion to net deficits over 10 years. That's not a ton, but then the ARRA was a lot, 787 billion net deficit increase. And then after those 2008, 2009 acts, you had kind of mostly pandemic related stimulus.
Well, I guess this is related to another comment, which is like, these are, I mean, some of these aren't spending increases, like 2/3 of the ARRA were tax cuts. And only about 1/3 of that total amount was spending increases. And you've just shown the spending side. But then also with I thought it was interesting though, the CBO, and I guess I don't understand necessarily why this decision was made, but it looks like it's counted a lot of the American Rescue Plan and the CARES Act, those stimulus payments to individuals, those are really tax credits, but they're counting them on the expenditure side rather than on the revenue side. I don't know why they did that. I don't know if you kind of understand why that was done, but that's another reason you're seeing the big blips in deficits and is showing up here as outlays. But I think technically those were tax reductions.
Yeah, I mean, on one level, those are accounting issues. On one level, those are things, you know, whether it's revenue or whether it's spending, it's adding to deficits. And that when I get to the simulation at the end, it's that distinction's not going to be as important. But you're right. If we were to look at this in terms of revenues, in fact, I'll show you in a second revenues as a percent of GDP. Maybe I can just jump to that, Jason, since you brought that up. Let me go back to that. I think I've got revenues. Let's see, that's receipts. Here's receipts as a percent of gross domestic product. So forget the colors by party control for a second. Receipts in 2008, let's see, 2006, 7, 8, receipts go down during the Great Recession and then pop back up as the economy is recovering. And then receipts were pretty stable in 2020. My guess is that they'll be similar in 2021. We don't have that data yet. But spending, let's see, I have non-interest spending as well, this time series. Yeah, so here's non-interest spending as a percent of GDP. That does spike in the Great Recession, and it spikes really big in the pandemic. And I don't think that's just the accounting issue that you bring up, right? I think that accounting distinction kind of changes the amounts a little bit, but it doesn't change the broad trend that it was mostly spending stuff. But like this is, you want to be able to look at these data and see You want to look at this time series. You want to be able to recreate this time series. This one I've added recession bars. If we were to look at the code, let me see, time series, which one is this going to be? Time series, this one. So this code is going to have, it's bringing in some data that also includes, let's see, where's the data? It's bringing in some party control stuff. It's bringing in some recession data. And I just want to highlight the place in here that makes the recession bars. So here's some code for making recession bars in a plot like this. It's never fun to do this the first time, but it's now the code's here and anyone can just pick this up, and that's going to give you a picture like this. It has recession bars. It's got these, the legend, I can mute certain colors. If I click on each legend, notice all the green circles kind of dimmed out and we can just see the red and blue for Republican and Democrat control. Another thing, if you look across the top of this image, you've got different tabs. So this shows you different definitions of party control. So one is that one party controls the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives. Another one is just White House and Senate. Another one is just White House and House of Representatives. When I click on these tabs, the colors in the circles change. And then I've got some scatter plots showing how does receipts as a percent of GDP change with the number of Democratic Senate seats. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward, but I've got this for receipts as a percent of GDP by Democratic Senate seats, by Democratic House seats. I've got that for non-interest spending, and I've got that for overall deficits as well. A couple of the kind of results that come out of that when I come back to this table of contents, that receipts, the tax policy is essentially independent of party control. That's not the lever that once you come to power in the White House and Congress that you pull. It's mainly the non-interest spending where you see when a party gains control, they get higher non-interest spending. All right, the last thing I want to focus on is this debt stabilization options. And here is, let's see, where are my pictures? So what I'm going to do, the red line is the CBO forecast of debt to GDP that shows it going from a little over 100% in 2020 up to 195% by 2050, 30 years from now. And I'm going to use the OGUSA open source macroeconomic model and just running the baseline, which has current tax policy, spending policy, and it's calibrated to the United States. Running that baseline to get something similar in terms of endpoints, 2050 and 2021, in terms of debt to GDP. It's a little different in the transition. We can talk about why that might be, but I'm going to skip that for right now. But this is a calibrated baseline, and the experiment I want to do is, if we cut government discretionary spending, how much do we have to cut it to get this debt to GDP path to go from about 100% in 2021 to 130% in 2050, 30 years from now? You know, how big is that spending cut? And then how much, the second experiment is how much would taxes have to be increased? And I'm going to increase the corporate income tax rate, the marginal tax rates on personal income, and pass-through income tax rates. All of those schedules, I'm going to increase them by the same percentage. How much, by what percent do taxes need to be increased to get the same debt to GDP effect? So here are the results in terms of debt to GDP. Government spending are the green triangles, the spending cut. The tax increase is these little purplish squares, and then the baseline that we just saw in the previous figure is the blue circles. I want to show what are the macro effects of those two policies, because they do the same thing. The spending cut and the tax increase respectively do the same thing to this debt to GDP path. What do they do to the macroeconomics? And I'll just say that the spending cut is to cut discretionary spending from 5% of GDP down to 3.3% of GDP. So that's a 1.7 percentage point cut in government discretionary spending. That amounts to just under $400 billion a year. I mean, so that's a number that looks similar to some of the spending increases that we've seen. Actually, that's not true. That's the spending cut per year of almost $400 billion. That's a lot more. If you were to multiply that by 10, that's a $4 trillion cut over 10 years. So it takes a lot of spending to reduce the debt to GDP trajectory. And it's going to take a lot of tax increase as well. The tax increase is 34%. So that's like taking the corporate income tax rate from 21% to 28%. And that's like taking the top marginal income tax rate on personal income from 37% to 48%. So it's big changes to get these two results, but very different macroeconomic results. So let me just show you the spending cut first. These are the macroeconomic results of cutting government discretionary spending by 1.7 percentage points, and it's that $400 billion a year. There's actually not a lot of macroeconomic effect in the beginning years, except on consumption. And that's because government discretionary spending, the way it's modeled in the OGUSA model is, think of it as spending on national parks and national defense, where it's not really showing up in the pockets of US households and consumers. That's an oversimplification, right? A lot, if you think about just the infrastructure bill passed most recently, that is money that's going back into the economy and there's feedback. So that would actually show a little bit more effect in these early years. But cutting government spending creates a big decrease in interest rates, which you don't see in this picture, and a big increase in wages. And so you get a one-time 3% increase in aggregate consumption, and then households smooth that out over their lifetimes. But you do get big increases in the aggregate capital stock. So that's reduced crowding out. And you get a somewhat large increases in GDP. By 2030, GDP is nearly a percentage point higher than it would otherwise be. And in 30 years, it's nearly 4% higher than it would otherwise be. This is the only figure that I wasn't able to make in bokeh, but it's the distributional results. Let's see if I scroll down here. So what are households doing in response to this policy? Here it is. So this is the x-axis, which is hard to see. These are quantiles of the lifetime income distribution. Think of it as wealthy people on the right side of each of these figures and poor people on the left side. Consumption is increasing in the first 10 years by an average small amount, maybe 0.5%. Savings is decreasing by a little over 0.5% for people in all areas of the income distribution. Labor supply is increasing for everybody except for these people in the middle of the lifetime income distribution. And there's just not big changes across the distribution of individuals from this spending cut. And it seems to have pretty nice macroeconomic results in the long run. Now, the other policy is increasing taxes. And let me actually show, before I even show these macro results, if I go to all of these simulations of the OGUSA model are available in this branch of my personal repository. So I've forked the OGUSA repository, and then I've created a branch called US Debt and Deficits. And in here in the examples folder, you can see the script to run OGUSA. And here's the policy change. I'm changing all the personal income tax rates by a fixed percentage. So here's the defaults, and there's some expirations of these of certain tax cuts from the TCJA in 2026. So I'm increasing those amounts as well in 2026 by the same percentage. I'm increasing all the pass-through rates, and then where is the corporate? And then I'm increasing the corporate income tax rate by that same percent, that's 34%. So taking it from 21%, it ends up going up to 28%. So you can replicate these simulations. The tax increase, if I keep spending where it is and increase taxes, you see some market decreases in things like labor supply. Obviously, if your income's being taxed at a higher rate, reduces the return to labor, so you get reduced labor supply. The aggregate capital stock actually increases over time. That's because the increased government revenue actually reduces the debt, so there's more capital available for the aggregate capital stock, and it's a wash in the first 5 years and then starts slowly increasing. So that's kind of the reduced crowding out. But consumption in the long run, labor supply and GDP all decrease from these tax cuts. So let me back out of this for a second now and just kind of sum up what we've seen. You saw a few simulations of policies to stabilize debt to GDP in the United States. You saw some visualizations describing debt and deficits and how they're related to party control, how they're related to different categories of spending. And those were in some dynamic visualizations that can be manipulated by a layperson. They can be downloaded and run by someone with a little more expertise. With someone with a lot of expertise, they can modify those and augment those. And then the simulations of the macro model are things that can be downloaded. All the economic assumptions can be scrutinized, and sensitivity to different results can be checked. And this is a way to really, the debate on how to stabilize the national debt in the United States and deficits is going to be polarizing. And there are going to be winners and losers in the different policies that can be implemented to stabilize the debt. And it's really important, I think, that the models to do those analyses be open source, to remove some of the political polarized debate that happens around these things. And then also, like, someone might say, Rick, I don't believe your spending cut results because you don't have any of the feedback from government infrastructure. And we actually have, because of questions like that, we have a pull request open right now and almost finished in the OGUSA model to implement that kind of government capital and infrastructure spending that feeds back into the economy. So with that, I'd kind of, I think that's all I've got. I'd love to open this up to questions.
Rick, I really enjoyed the presentation. I love the dynamic visualizations, like you said. Being able to hover over, click on them, really allows the user to explore those figures. And I was thinking along the lines of that table you had with the different stimulus packages passed in the last 12 years or so, kind of imagining a visualization where you could go and like do the counterfactual of like peel those back or add them to your figure and see how those deficits change as a result. Would be pretty interesting.
Yeah, so that would be very doable.
I mean, there are issues, right? The economy is changing and so on, but you could think about a way to kind of make this on a apples to apples basis, even though the economy has evolved since 2008 in ways that may not have been expected by, say, the Bush administration. But I do think that's one of the real benefits of the figures as you've created them, is that ability to really explore the data. I guess I was also thinking too, it's kind of a shame that Jupyter Book doesn't compile very well to a nicely formatted PDF file like you're showing here, because you could have all of this in a document with all of these words and tables and have the figures fully interactive. Right now, you've kind of had to separate them. And that's, I think, I'm sure that'll come at some point, but right now that's a shame. You're a little bit limited there, where you need to produce this nicely formatted paper document or virtual document, I guess, but you can't embed those nice dynamic visualizations into this.
Yeah, so that's where, I mean, you really have to have a website for that. That's where you can create interactive tables that have these like you could click on one of the lines of that table to either turn that policy on or off, and it would interact with a model under the hood. That could be on a website where the model's being served somewhere in the cloud. We have widgets that do that using Heroku, where it's actually serving a model that either generates the visualization, or like Compute Studio, which has been highlighted many times on these demo days, that serves these models in the cloud. And then some of the output that comes back includes tabular data. But what you're describing is very doable on a web page. I haven't seen it yet, where tabular data is one of the inputs to the model that turns inputs to the model on or off. But these are all ways to make model experimentation more interactive. I think the ability to crowdsource solutions to things like stabilizing the debt is really important. Like, think how specific those two policy experiments I looked at are. I mean, you've got a cut in discretionary government spending. What if we looked at a cut in mandatory government spending? Where there are infinity other tax increase options or reduction in tax credits that we could look at, and each of those is going to have a different effect on the macro economy and on the underlying distribution of households and firms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess final question: where should we look for this paper?
Yeah, it'll be coming out in the Baker Institute, but anyone who's interested, I'm happy to send a draft around. I mean, just full disclosure, if I click on this section, I mean, so my introduction still has a bunch of bullets, and my executive summary is blank. This talk is essentially the executive summary. And then when I look at risks of high government debt, you know, this section right now is all bullets. I know exactly what I want to say. I just want to put it in. Yeah, so it's not done, but anyone interested in, in fact, I wasn't sharing my screen, was I?
Not just that.
That was less effective. Yeah, so this is just these sections. There are sections in here where I know what I want to say, but it's currently in bullet points. So anyone who wants that, I'm happy to pass a copy around. It. I'm trying desperately to finish it before the Build Back Better Act gets passed. I think that puts a deadline of this week.
All right, well, we'll look for it.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Jason.
Rick, thanks a lot.